Matteo Zwingli was born into the unyielding precision of a world that never allowed for flaws. His childhood, like the fabric of his father's tailor shop, was defined by straight lines, tight stitches, and a relentless sense of order. His father, a man of few words and unwavering discipline, would often say, "A crooked seam can ruin a suit, Matteo." People noticed the floor before they noticed the fabric. To the untrained eye, the tailor's shop was just another place where time passed in the hum of scissors, the smell of wax, and the rhythm of measuring tapes. But to Matteo, it was the world. Every moment, every task, had its own prescribed rhythm. There was no room for deviation, no room for error. He learned early that the smallest mistake could destroy not only the fabric but the trust that was sewn into it. There was something about that mantra that clung to him, something that seeped into the very marrow of his bones. His father, while not one to openly show affection, had a way of molding Matteo's sense of duty, discipline, and precision. He could tell if the seams of a suit were off by the tiniest fraction of an inch. It was a gift, his father would say. But it was also a curse. It meant that every aspect of his life was held to the same exacting standard, a standard that left no room for mistakes, for softness, but beneath the cold, stoic surface, there was a secret he carried with him. One that not even his father knew. His sister, Lena, had been the only person who had ever truly seen him. She had a way of looking past the sharp lines and hard edges that defined him. When they were children, she would drape curtains over his shoulders, and he would stand still in the living room as she crowned him king of the living room. A game of make-believe. He never smiled, but he never refused either. He understood the game, understood the need for stillness. But that was before she was taken from him. Lena had died when Matteo was 19. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't tragic in the sense of grand events. It was something much more painful, something quiet and unseen. Appendicitis, misdiagnosed as a common stomach bug. A nurse who hesitated. A doctor who waited for a form to be signed before they acted. By the time they realized the true nature of her condition, it was too late. That moment of hesitation, that failure to act, haunted Matteo long after. In that cold winter, as snow blanketed the ground, Matteo stood before his father's portrait, the same one that hung in the hall of their family home, showing his grandfather in his Swiss Guard uniform. Halberd in hand, standing with the same stoic gaze that Matteo had inherited. The legacy was clear, inescapable. His grandfather had served during the papacy of John Paul II, a sentinel of history, a man of duty. That winter, Matteo made a decision that changed the course of his life. He applied to join the Swiss Guard. It wasn't about the uniform or the pomp, though the ceremony certainly spoke to something deep within him. It wasn't even about the legacy of his grandfather, though that certainly weighed heavily on his heart. No, for Matteo, it was something much simpler, much more personal. The idea that sometimes, protocol and silence weren't enough. That sometimes, someone had to act when no one else would. The guards were not just protectors, they were symbols. The eyes of the world were upon them, and they stood in silence, immovable, a part of the architecture, as if carved into the stone of St. Peter's Basilica itself. Yet Matteo knew that the weight of that silence could sometimes be a burden too great to bear. At 22, Matteo passed every test, each one a crucible that forged him into something more than just a man in uniform. His every movement was precise, efficient, cold, like a machine. The drills, the sparring, the endless hours of standing still, he mastered them all. Within 3 years, he was selected for ceremonial duty, a position that required him to stand still for hours, the embodiment of discipline and dignity. His uniform, a perfect display of red, blue, and yellow, hung on him with quiet pride. It was not vanity that drove him, but a profound respect for the centuries of history and honor woven into each thread, his record, impeccable. Not a single missed salute. Not a single deviation from the path set before him. In the heat of August, when even the stone of the Vatican seemed to sweat under the sun's gaze, a junior guard collapsed beside him, his face pale and his body shaking from the heat. But Matteo remained still, like a statue carved into the ancient stones. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply stood as protocol dictated. Zwingli's not a man, someone had once said with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He's a metronome with lungs. It wasn't that Matteo lacked emotions. He had feelings, deep ones, sometimes too deep to express. But he had learned that restraint was the highest form of respect, both to the institution he served and to the memory of those who had come before him. His emotions, like his movements, were to be carefully controlled, kept behind the walls of duty. The only person who ever seemed to see through those walls was Lena. When they were children, she would press him to play her games, dressing him in costumes, turning him into whatever prince or king she dreamed up. And he would stand there, silent, watching her with a mixture of adoration and the quiet acknowledgement that she was the only one who could reach past the exterior he wore so well. She was the only one who had seen him beyond the stiff uniform, beyond the unwavering discipline. When she died, Matteo's world shattered. His world of precision and control, of duty and order, became less certain. The rules he had lived by seemed so inadequate, so cold, in the face of loss. He had seen firsthand the cost of waiting, of following protocol when a life hung in the balance. It was a lesson that would never leave him. Sometimes, the lines you draw are not enough to protect what matters, and so, when he joined the Swiss Guard, it wasn't just about continuing his grandfather's legacy. It wasn't even just about serving the Pope or upholding the traditions of the Vatican. It was about something deeper. It was about the desire to be something more than just a figure in a uniform. It was about stepping forward, when everyone else stood still, and making a difference when it was needed most. By the time he had served for 13 years, Matteo had become the quintessential Swiss Guard. Tall, symmetrical, his posture always textbook perfect, his movements precise. He was the kind of man photographers loved. The kind of man who represented centuries of unbroken tradition, who stood as an unwavering symbol of the Church's history. But there were moments when Matteo was more than just a symbol. There were moments when he was a man who had the weight of something more than protocol pressing on his shoulders. Even after all those years, after all the standing still and maintaining the facade of stone, there was still a part of Matteo that longed for something different. A part of him that questioned the stillness, the rigidity, the unyielding need for perfection. A part of him that wondered what would happen if, just once, he broke formation. What would happen if he stepped forward when no one else would? And it was that part of him, the part buried deep within his chest, that would lead him to the most unexpected moment of his life. Matteo had stood through countless ceremonies, watched as the Vatican's grand rituals unfolded year after year, each one a reflection of centuries-old tradition. The routines, the preparations, the sacred choreography, they had become like the fabric of his own life. And yet, even as he stood proudly among his fellow guards, there was an undercurrent of change rippling just beneath the surface of the Vatican's marble walls. The papal conclave had gathered, as it had done for centuries, in the Sistine Chapel, where the sacred smoke would rise once again to announce the world's newest spiritual leader. The world's eyes were fixed on the Vatican as the decision was made. The cardinals, the men whose lives had been spent in the shadow of the Church's immense power, were once again locked in a silent, secretive dance. Whispers floated down the corridors, and each turn of a page in the red leather-bound book seemed to mark another moment of history, of tradition. And then, on the morning of the announcement, something happened that shook the very foundations of the Vatican. The white smoke curled into the sky, rising above St. Peter's Square. For a moment, the world held its breath. It was the moment they had all been waiting for. But when the name of the new pope was revealed, it was not who the world had expected. The name that echoed through the square was Leo XIV, a name that had not been spoken in over a century, a name that carried with it the weight of conservatism, of staunch belief. But this time, the reaction was different. Cardinal João Luís Santiago, a man from the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, was the one who would step onto the balcony as Pope Leo XIV. The Vatican had anticipated a different kind of man, one who would represent the establishment, someone who would maintain the status quo. Instead, they got a man who had walked among the poor, who had washed the feet of drug addicts, and who had held confession in the most unlikely places, shipping containers, street corners, and back alleys. Matteo stood in the barracks with his fellow guards when the announcement came. The room fell into stunned silence. No one spoke at first, not a single word, just the clicking of the old wooden chairs against the stone floors. The air was thick with disbelief. "That's not the man they wanted," someone muttered, but Matteo could hear the underlying edge of awe in the voice. No one had expected a pope like Leo XIV, too young, too modern, too unknown. Matteo was not surprised. In fact, he felt something stir inside him as he watched the new pope take his first steps into the light. There was something about his eyes. Not confidence, not arrogance, but conviction. The look of a man who had accepted the enormous weight placed upon his shoulders and made the decision to carry it quietly, without protest, without hesitation. As the days passed, the Vatican's carefully constructed walls began to crack, ever so slightly. The Pope's actions, his refusal to wear the traditional red slippers, his choice to decline the throne and instead sit in a humble wooden chair, disrupted the careful rhythms that had long been established. Matteo noticed it more than anyone. He saw how the old guard of the Vatican, the cardinals who wore their disappointment like a second skin, began to shift uneasily. The bureaucrats, the ones who had spent their lives safeguarding the traditions of the Church, found themselves unnerved by the Pope's informality. His refusal to follow the script, to adhere to the preordained steps of the ceremony, was unsettling. It was a reminder that the power of the Church, once so immovable, was beginning to face something new. But for Matteo, there was something magnetic about Leo's approach. It wasn't just rebellion or youthful idealism, it was something else. It was the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing to prove. Who was willing to dismantle the scaffolding of tradition to build something more meaningful beneath it. In the midst of all this, Matteo remained in his post, standing at attention, keeping his eyes trained on the Pope's movements. He didn't question the changes, at least not aloud. But inside, something was stirring, something deeper than curiosity, an unspoken tension between the traditions he had upheld for over a decade and the new way that Leo XIV was shaping the future. The morning of the inauguration arrived in a quiet hush, as though the entire city was holding its breath. Matteo awoke before the bells rang, rising from his bed with the same methodical precision that had been ingrained in him for years. His uniform gleamed, the polished steel of his armor catching the first light of dawn. Everything was in its place, the trousers, the chain mail, the tunic, the belt. He didn't need to think about it, it was muscle memory, each piece of armor falling into place like a carefully measured stitch in a finely tailored suit. The Swiss guard was called to the lower hall for final instructions. Commandant Ulrich, his commanding officer, stood at the front, his white hair sharp and his voice like gravel. The man was a living embodiment of tradition. The kind of man who would never question the rules, who would uphold them until his dying breath. "You are not security," Ulrich began, his tone steady and commanding. "Let me repeat that. You are not security." The words hit the room with the force of a cannonball. They were not to be the guardians of the Pope's safety, not the protectors of his life. They were symbols. Living statues, standing at exact intervals, their every movement calculated, their every breath measured. "If someone collapses near you, you do not move," Ulrich continued, his gaze sweeping over the room of guards. "If a camera flashes in your eyes, you do not move. If a child screams, if a dog barks, if thunder splits the sky, you do not move. If one of you flinches, it will be remembered longer than the homily." Matteo, standing in the third row, absorbed every word. His face remained neutral, as always, but his mind was like a razor, dissecting each command, each nuance. It was clear that today was no ordinary day. This was more than just another ceremonial walk. This was history. And history, he knew, demanded perfection. The final preparations unfolded in a tense, almost reverent silence. The bells of St. Peter's rang out at 10 a.m., their sound reverberating through the square, marking the beginning of the procession. The gates opened, and the first line of altar servers, dressed in white, moved slowly down the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, bearing crosses and candles. The cardinals followed, their red robes flashing against the marble, walking with a slow deliberateness that spoke of their power and their age. And then, there was Pope Leo XIV. He emerged not with fanfare, not with the grandiosity that Matteo had grown used to, but with a quiet, unassuming presence. The Pope did not walk like a man about to assume the highest office in the land. He walked like a priest in his parish, as though he were simply moving among his people, undeterred by the weight of the occasion. Matteo's eyes followed him closely. His halberd, held in a perfect, vertical position, reflected the sunlight as the Pope neared. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of awe and confusion. There were cheers, yes, but also hushed whispers. Matteo could hear one cardinal lean toward another and speak in a low voice, lips thin with disapproval. But the Pope, undisturbed, continued on his path. For Matteo, the moment felt like a tremor, deep beneath the marble floor. He could feel it. Something was shifting in the air, something more powerful than the Pope's walk, more important than the ceremony unfolding around him. It was the feeling of history in the making, and it made him more alive than he had felt in years. The procession continued, a slow-moving river of humanity, moving toward its destination. As they neared Matteo's position, he watched the Pope closely, noting his every step, his every gesture. The guards around him remained still, unmoving as the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, it happened. A man, seemingly out of nowhere, stumbled forward from the edge of the press zone, breaking through the barricades and into the procession path. Matteo's eyes flicked to him in an instant, his training kicking in. The man was moving too quickly, reaching inside his coat as though he had something to hide. A cold chill ran down Matteo's spine. He didn't think, he simply acted. Without a moment's hesitation, Matteo took 2 swift steps forward, crossing the invisible line of the ceremony. His voice rang out, low but commanding, slicing through the tension of the square. Step back. The world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. The man halted, his hand still half inside his coat. Matteo's arm shot out, not to strike, but to stop him, halt his movement with the firmness of a man who had spent his life training for this very moment. The crowd gasped. The cameras clicked, but no one moved. The sky above St. Peter's Square was a pale blue, a gentle Roman sun beginning to filter through the crisp morning air. Everything, as always, was precisely timed. Matteo had risen before the bells of St. Peter's rang. His morning ritual was as familiar to him as the back of his hand: trousers, tunic, breastplate, chainmail, and boots, each piece a symbol of the duty he had sworn to uphold. His movements were automatic, ingrained by years of discipline. There was no need to think. No need to hesitate. In the barracks, the other guards moved with the same precision, as if they were all part of a well-oiled machine, their routine synchronized to perfection. The calm before the storm. A storm, Matteo knew, was inevitable. The day of the inauguration of Pope Leo XIV, this transition of power, would be a moment seared into history. It wasn't a time for mistakes, for deviations, for any break in form. The Swiss Guard, dressed in their iconic red, blue, and yellow uniforms, stood in their designated positions throughout St. Peter's Square. Matteo was no different. He stood still, as immovable as the statues that lined the ancient piazza. His eyes scanned the crowds, noting the movements of dignitaries and the press corps, the subtle shift of the sun casting long shadows over the cobblestones. He was a living statue, there to be seen, but never to move. This was the role of the Swiss Guard, an eternal symbol of loyalty, duty, and discipline. His position was the third in line from the papal platform, directly facing the path the Pope would take. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind of silence that precedes something monumental. The square was filled with thousands of pilgrims, dignitaries, and visitors, all waiting for the first public appearance of Pope Leo XIV. The procession would begin shortly. As Matteo stood at attention, the familiar rhythm of his breathing steady and even, his mind remained sharp, his focus unbroken. There were no distractions, until, suddenly, there was one. A movement, a flicker of motion caught at the corner of his vision. It was so quick that at first, Matteo barely registered it. The man appeared out of nowhere, a wiry figure dressed in a dark suit, standing on the edge of the press zone. Matteo's gaze immediately snapped toward him. The man was acting oddly, his body language anxious, almost furtive, his eyes darting from side to side as he moved toward the barricades. Matteo's instincts kicked in, and something deep within him stirred. He could feel it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a crack in the facade of perfection. It was a moment of danger, one that could not be ignored. The man stumbled forward, awkwardly bumping past the barricades that had been set in place to keep the press at a safe distance. His movements were erratic, almost too fast for someone merely trying to get a better view. His hand reached inside his coat. It was then that the tension in the air thickened. A cold feeling washed over Matteo, his pulse quickening, his muscles tightening. The Pope was just moments away, walking along the path that led from the papal platform to the altar. The security team was in position, but there was no sign of them reacting to the figure pushing through the barricades. The man's sudden movement, the way his hand disappeared inside his jacket, sent a jolt of fear through Matteo's chest. In that moment, everything seemed to slow. His training, his instincts, everything he had learned over the years, clicked into place. Without thinking, Matteo's body moved before his mind could catch up. He stepped forward. Crossing the invisible boundary of the ceremonial space, his halberd still gripped firmly in his right hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess himself. His voice, when it came, was like the crack of a whip, sharp, clear, and unyielding. "Step back." The words carried across the square, sharp and commanding. They cut through the stillness of the ceremony like a sudden gust of wind. The sound of Matteo's voice echoed in the tense air, the vibrations lingering in the marble. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. The man froze. His hand, still partly inside his coat, halted mid-motion. Time seemed to stretch, the world falling into an eerie silence. Matteo's gaze locked on the man's. The flicker of panic in the stranger's eyes, his breath shallow. For a moment, the square held its collective breath. Everyone stopped moving, every eye on the scene. The cameras, trained on the Pope, clicked and clattered as they tried to capture the unfolding drama. But the Pope, undisturbed, continued his quiet march toward the altar. The attention of the world shifted for a moment, a tiny disruption in the fabric of the ceremony. The man's eyes darted nervously, then he began to speak in rapid Italian, his words tumbling over one another in panic. "I'm press. I'm press. I'm press. I showed my ID." But the words did little to reassure anyone. Matteo didn't move, his stance resolute, his body as unmoving as the stone statues surrounding them. His halberd gleamed in the sunlight, held firmly in his hand, its weight steady against his side. The man stood still, caught between the wordless command of the Swiss guard and his own panic. It wasn't until two Vatican security officers, dressed in black suits and earpieces, surged forward from the back of the procession, their hands quickly grabbing hold of the man and pulling him away from the path of the Pope. Another officer took the bag from his hands. The man, still shouting in Italian, was dragged through the barriers and out of sight. Only then did Matteo take a step back. His pulse was still racing, his heart hammering in his chest, but his stance did not waver. He had done his duty. The moment lasted no more than 20 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. The world continued around him. The ceremonial hymn resumed, but there was an undercurrent of unease. The cameras panned over the crowd, and the air was filled with the sound of applause, albeit somewhat hesitant. Matteo stood in his place, unmoving, his eyes still locked ahead. But in the corners of his mind, he felt the weight of what had just happened. He had broken formation. In the span of those few seconds, Matteo had stepped forward when every rule, every inch of training, every expectation demanded that he remain still. He had crossed the line of ceremony, of silence, and moved when no one else had. The world had watched as he did it, and in that moment, the silence that had defined the Swiss guard was shattered. The rest of the ceremony continued, but the ripple of what Matteo had done would not fade. The square was still buzzing, the whispers swirling through the crowds, through the Vatican corridors, and through the hidden chambers of those who held the true power. The press would dissect every angle, every word, every action, as they always did. The moment Matteo had broken formation had been captured. replayed over and over again, in slow motion, on every screen. The question now was, why had the Pope's own security frozen? Was there a real threat? Or had Matteo overstepped his bounds? Matteo, though, had no answers. He simply returned to his position, straightened his back, and lifted his halberd, just as he had done thousands of times before. But beneath his armor, his muscles were tense, his mind racing. The breach had been made. The quiet walls of protocol had cracked, even if only for an instant, and in that fleeting moment, everything had changed. The square was alive with the sound of hundreds of cameras clicking, the hum of anticipation, and the soft murmur of the crowd as the procession continued. The Pope, Pope Leo XIV, walked slowly through the sea of faces, his steps calm and unhurried. Despite the formality of the occasion, there was something about his demeanor that seemed almost detached from the weight of the papacy. He moved through the crowd as though he was walking through a familiar congregation, his hands reaching out to bless those closest to him, nodding at the children, stopping to acknowledge the elderly. Matteo's eyes never left the Pope. He was there for a singular purpose, to stand, to be seen, to remain unflinching in the face of everything that transpired. His eyes darted from the Pope to the surrounding environment, scanning for any signs of movement that didn't belong, and then, from the corner of his vision, a flicker of movement caught his attention. A man, hastily moving through the crowd, his jacket flapping as he pushed through the barricade set up to keep the press at a safe distance. Matteo's heartbeat skipped for a moment. The man was coming toward the Pope's path, too fast, too erratically. There was a sense of urgency in his movements, his body language betraying anxiety. Matteo's gaze snapped to the man, instinct and years of training kicking in. The man's hand was reaching inside his coat. His movements were swift, deliberate, and Matteo's pulse quickened. He could feel the tension rising in the air. The square, which had once been a space of quiet reverence, now felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. He could see the security around the Pope, 2 members of the Vatican's elite gendarmerie, watching the crowd, but they didn't react to the man's sudden movement. They were too far away, their attention divided. In an instant, Matteo's mind made the decision. There was no time to think. There was no room for hesitation. With the sharp precision that only years of drill could ingrain into a man, Matteo stepped forward from his position, breaking the formation. His boots hit the cobblestones with a decisive thud. His left arm extended, not in a gesture of aggression, but of command, halting the man in his tracks. His voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos that was beginning to stir in the square. Step back. The word sliced through the air like a whip, loud enough to stop even the most distracted onlookers. The man froze. His eyes went wide as the halberd gleamed in Matteo's hand, its shaft angled and ready. The tension in the air thickened as the crowd held its collective breath, their eyes darting between Matteo, the man, and the Pope, who had not flinched. Not even turned to look at the disruption unfolding a few meters away. The man's hand remained inside his coat, but the fear on his face was clear. He wasn't sure if Matteo was about to strike, if he would be subdued by force. And then, as the seconds dragged on, the man slowly withdrew his hand, exposing a press badge. He mumbled something in rapid Italian, his voice thick with panic. Matteo, a Swiss guard, breaks formation during a sacred ceremony in St. Peter's Square to stop a man moving unpredictably. The man turns out to be a photojournalist, not a threat. Though Matteo acted out of instinct to protect the Pope, his actions disrupted the ceremony and sparked controversy in the media and within the Vatican. Senior church officials criticized Matteo for violating strict ceremonial protocol, emphasizing that he is a symbol, not a soldier. He is temporarily removed from ceremonial duty. Later, Pope Leo XIV privately invites Matteo to the papal gardens. Instead of reprimanding him, the Pope shares a personal story and expresses understanding. He commends Matteo's sense of duty and reinstates him. Matteo returns to his post with a deeper awareness that true loyalty isn't about rigid obedience, but knowing when to step forward to protect what truly matters. Sometimes, even tradition must adapt to stay alive. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.